Hello and welcome to our Adult Ed today. This is the Adult Ed for Sunday, February 6th. So wherever you are and whenever you're watching this, glad you can join us. Today we are continuing our series, Let's Talk About Sex. We are continuing this as a fully virtual offering, and really glad that we're able to continue on with this. Today we have the distinct honor and pleasure of being joined by Covenant member Brad Brown, who is the, I have it right here, professor of educational psychology at U.W Madison. He is wise. Over the years, I've learned to listen to him, and I think we will all benefit from this today to talk and learn more about how youth and young folks are engaging in dialogue and thinking about sex. So I will pray, and then I will turn it over to Brad, and let's pray. Good and gracious God, we give thanks for this day and for the opportunity to learn and grow together. We are called to be your people, and as such, we are called to learn about one another, to engage in hard topics, and to understand where your word, your hope, and your call fits into this. May we learn so that we may be responsible and responsive to the needs of your people, our community. Amen. All right, Brad, I'm going to spotlight you, mute myself, and then you can unmute yourself. There you go.
Thank you very much, Jeff. It's just a wonderful pleasure to be here today, but I have to begin with a true confession. That is, I had an epiphany this week, and I decided that young people should not be the only human beings having sex. This is something that I think ought to be engaged in by individuals of all ages. So although I did indicate in my title that I was going to focus on young people, and indeed we will draw some of our conversation around issues of young people or information from scientists about young people, I really want to broaden this and think about the question of love and sex across the lifespan. I think the last sessions that we've had have been incredibly informative and certainly taught me a lot of things, but I want to do two things that are a little bit different today from what we've done in the past. The first is to be more intentionally biblical. Some of the last sessions have brought a little bit of the Bible and a little bit of faith and theology into the session, but we're going to do that a little bit more intentionally today. And the second thing is I want to be a bit more interactive so that we have an opportunity to really converse with each other today above and beyond the chat. And Jeff has explained that we're going to try to do some breakout rooms here so that individuals have an opportunity to spend a few minutes talking in smaller groups with each other. Again, not recorded, so strictly confidential. If you say something that is absolutely scintillating, nobody's going to hear it for posterity, so you may want to save that for when we get back together. I want to concentrate on three questions today. First, why do human beings have sex? What is the point of sexual activity? What are the functions that it serves? Second, what does love have to do with sexuality? It's really not inherent in sex, as we'll see in a moment. So what's love got to do with it? And third, what's love got to do more specifically with what I'm going to call good Christian sex? So why do human beings have sex? What's love got to do with it? And what's love got to do with good Christian sex? I want to talk about those things, but let's see if I may just talk about a few things as preludes to that particular conversation. So if we turn to that first question of why individuals have sex, I think I can point to three major functions that sex serves. Evolutionary scientists would say that the primary function is procreation, survival, propagation of the species. And of course, that's very sensible because of a substantial portion of human beings don't have sex. In a relatively brief period of time, the species would become extinct. But that's not the only reason why we have sex. There is a second, which I'm going to call recreation, that brings together pleasure, passion, sexual desire, because it turns out that in many cases, sex actually feels pretty good. During sexual activity, especially at the height or climax of the activity, the body actually releases several feel-good substances that give persons what you might call a natural high. And evolutionary scientists would suggest, again, that this is actually very sensible and perhaps an outcome of evolution, because early in evolutions, humans who found sexuality to be pleasurable were more likely to engage in sex more often, and thus more likely to reproduce and pass on those genes to other individuals, so that over time, most individuals, not all individuals, and that's really an important component of evolution as well, but most individuals are going to find sex pleasurable. So this is kind of nature's incentive for an activity that was essential for species survival. Sex was a desirable recreational activity. Now, there is a third factor that really has more to do with cultures and interpersonal relationships, and not too much to do that I can figure out with evolution. And I'm going to call that the association feature of sexuality. And it has to do with solidifying connections. This comes in two forms. The first is what we might call pragmatic, in that it creates a bond between vested interests. So think about noble families in the medieval ages, where the offspring of one monarch would marry the offspring of another monarch. And when that relationship was consummated, that meant that there was an alliance, a bond between those two countries, so that they could work together. And that also works, I think, perhaps not just between nation states, but between families. So we know that alliances between two powerful families often were formed and continue to be formed through the marriage of individuals from those two families. Of course, it works in reverse as well. Heaven forbid that the offspring of two battling foes have sex, because that threatens the rivalry. So you think of Hatfields versus McCoys, Montagues versus Capulets, Cripps versus Bloods. There are times in which individuals who come together across those families are going to disrupt the lack of alliances of individuals. So there's that sort of pragmatic function that sexuality has served through the ages. And a second version of association is more personal. It has to do with the bond between two individuals. And we could call that a sort of romantic relationship. Sex can be used to solidify interpersonal relationships and turn it into a romantic relationship. And this is where love comes into the picture. And we can begin to ask the question, what's love got to do with it? So we're going to focus our attention on this part 3A of the primary functions of sex and talk about the romantic functions of sexuality. And before our conversation, let me just introduce a little bit of science here, because scientists have spoken to this issue of the connection between love and sex. There's lots of focus in the scientific community on the initiation into sexual activities, and particularly on one particular aspect of sex, and that is penile vaginal sex, or what I'll call PV sex. And that tends to remain the benchmark of sexual activity and the scientific studies of sex, even though other forms of sexual activity are very important and also garnering a bit more attention, including sexual activity between members of the same sex. And notice I'm using sex here as opposed to gender, thinking back to earlier presentations that we've had. At any rate, in the United States, the median age at first PV sex right now is, anybody know? Around about age 18. That's a little later than it has been in the past. But that's kind of interesting, because by sort of the end of senior year in high school, about 50% of young people report that they have had PV sex. And what's interesting about that is that in high school, 79% of cis males and 89% of cis females report that that first sexual encounter occurred in the context of a romantic relationship, not something that was more individual. If we're thinking back to, if you were with us this morning at 9 o'clock, the way that Jeff described things not being discussed in Song of Songs. Now, some of those relationships are fairly short-term. They only last about 6 months. And interestingly enough, 25% of the couples who talk about having first PV sex in these romantic relationships only did so once. But romantic relationships seem to be the place in which those relationships are occurring. When we look past high school, the picture is different. Then hookup culture begins to occur, and hookups refer to short-term relationships that are focused exclusively on sex, in which individuals usually are just acquaintances and often just to come together once and don't have an ongoing relationship that we might call romantic. Armstrong was one of the individuals who commented on this, and she said, and I quote, "Young people today, particularly young whites from affluent families, are expected to delay the commitments of adulthood while they invest in careers. They get the message that sex is okay as long as it doesn't jeopardize their futures. STDs, early pregnancies are to be avoided. And this generates a sort of limited liability hedonism, so that hookups make it possible to be sexually active while avoiding behaviors with the highest physical and emotional risks, like intense relationships." That seems to suggest that hookups serve their function. But if we look more carefully at this, we recognize that things get complicated in a hurry. A couple of my colleagues, Calabi and Furman, for example, did a rather interesting study that commented on hookup culture. And I should say in advance that 72% of college students say that they engaged in at least one hookup during college. It's also noteworthy in that study, by the way, that 20% of the sample had not yet had PV sex by their senior year in high school. And it's sort of a complicated situation here. On the one hand, hookup sex is more likely to involve drugs and alcohol, which leads to less use of protection and more use of coercion. On the other hand, the level of sexual activity in hookups does vary widely. It's not always PV or even anal sex. On one hand, many college students feel that romantic relationships interfere with an important agenda for them for studying or meeting people. On the other hand, studies suggest that for women, especially, sex is more satisfying in romantic relationships than it is in hookups. And we'll see that a little bit in Calabi and Furman's study. They followed 100 cis females and 100 cis males from 10th grade through the end of high school, and then interviewed them at 2.5, 4, and 5.5 years past high school. And they compared their experiences in romantic relationships, in relationships that we would call like sex with friends or friends with benefits, as well as in acquaintances, which are hookups. And here are some of their findings. And I quote again, "Our findings indicate that sexual activity per se does not translate to greater romantic life satisfaction or romantic appeal for emerging adults, but instead, emerging adults may feel more satisfied and romantically appealing when sexual activity occurs in tandem with the companionship and intimacy that a romantic relationship requires, that when we pair love and sex, if you will." They continue, "Alternatively, emerging adults with low romantic satisfaction or romantic appeal may seek out more frequent sexual activity with non-romantic partners. But their findings suggest that the sexual activity with an acquaintance or friend may be uniquely problematical for women." Now that seems to suggest that maybe hookups are not all they're made up to be. But on the other hand is another study of LGBTQ young adults that Watson and colleagues did that suggests that hookups for this group may actually be a healthy option. This was a small sample of lesbian, gay, and questioning young adults. And they concluded, again, I quote, "The positivity surrounding the hookups among our sample may be attributed, at least in part, to progressive and non-traditional sexual socialization around hooking up in queer communities. We need to consider the role of hookups in mitigating minority stressors." So we're kind of up in the air as to whether long-term romantic relationships, pairing love and sex, is a good thing in adolescence or young adulthood, or a not so good thing. It may depend on who And of course, we can move forward in time as well, because there is sex after 30, and there are surprisingly few studies of this particular phenomenon. There is one survey by a matchmaking website called Bustle, with which some individuals may be familiar, that suggests that individuals in later adulthood may be okay with casual sex. One survey indicated that the majority of older adults said casual sex was okay, but this was Bustle, and it appeals to a particular subsample of individuals, so it's not as scientifically rigorous as the others. This all just seems to me to suggest that things are up in the air a bit. So let's talk about this. Let's break out a bit into smaller groups, and I want to pose 3 questions to the smaller groups to discuss in like 7 minutes or so. First, we say sex changes relationships. What does that mean? How does sex change relationships? Second, what's the difference between sexual activity in a loving relationship as opposed to sexual activity in a casual relationship? And to push that a little bit, third, does your answer depend on the age of people in the relationship? Does it make a difference whether individuals are their teens versus 20-somethings versus people in their 40s, people in their 70s? So for the next 7 minutes, let's go into breakout sessions and talk about these 3 things. What does it mean when we say sex changes relationships? What's the difference between sexual activity in a loving relationship as opposed to a sexual activity in a casual relationship? And does your answer depend upon age? Let's talk about that, and then we'll come back and share some ideas. Comments that individuals want to share with the entire group from our breakout sessions. We had really an interesting conversation in ours. Anything that people would like to share more widely?
I'm monitoring. I'm monitoring to see who has things to say. Raise your hand, physically or on the Zoom. Peter, you're unmuted. Gunders, is that yes?
Yeah. I just wanted to share that. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to share that it's an enormous privilege for a friend and fellow church member to share such personal thoughts and feelings, and I felt very honored to be able to be present and be a listener, as well as share my own story. So I just wanted to thank everyone here for the courage to share what is clearly deeply personal and intimate sentiments. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Peter. I've noticed that through the various sessions that we've had in this series, that individuals have shared some very deeply personal things, because this subject can be deeply personal and deeply religious as well. And I want to turn our attention to that dimension here, if I may. So when we become a little bit more spiritual, theological with this, we can again revisit those 3 functions of sexuality and see whether or not they're really present in the Bible. When we think of procreation, that's definitely there. After all, when we turn to Genesis and look in chapter 1, verses 27 through 28, it reads in the Revised Standard Version something like, "So God created human beings in God's own image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. God created them. And God blessed them, and God said, be fruitful and multiply." We get a little bit different a version of that in Genesis 2:24. But the message there, I think, is really important, that this is the first commandment that God gave to humankind. Now, we have to remember that Genesis is probably not a literal thing, just like we can't read Song of Solomon's as anything but literal. This is not literal. It's more of mythical, if you will. Mythical not meaning that it's false, but rather it's a story. The facts of the story may not be exactly accurate, but it contains a major truth. And that major truth in this instance is that sex is an essential component of the relationship that human beings have with each other, and an essential component of the relationship human beings have with God. All human beings, not just one segment, but male and female, they both got the same directives here. And that there is a purpose, and that purpose is procreation. So we see that at various points within the Bible. When we turn our attention to recreation, we see that as well. If you went to church this morning at 9 o'clock, you heard Jeff talk about the Song of Solomon, which is itself a very sensual passage in the Bible that represents the sensual aspects of sexuality. And there are others that do. Proverbs 5 through 18, 18 through 19, rejoice in the wife of your youth, a lovely deer, a graceful doe. Let her breast fill you at times with delight, be intoxicated with her love. We also see that kind of in 1 Corinthians, which is surprising because Paul is not usually in this frame of mind, but in chapter 7, verses 3 through 5, he says the husband should give his rights to his wife, her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourself to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And there is something a little bit more like the Paul that I know and love, where he's worried much more about sex as being something that's going to be more problematical. And there are an awful lot of passages in the Bible that deal with sex being more problematical, and stipulating the kinds of relationships in which sex is okay and the relationships in which sex is not okay. When it comes to association, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I'm not finding much. Although I suppose we could read the Song of Solomon as talking not just about the sensuality, the desire, physical desire of love, but also a kind of loving relationship. Jesus doesn't talk a whole lot about sex. He focuses a little bit more attention on fidelity and adultery. And I think most Bible references to sexual activity opine about the dangers of and the consequences of sexual immorality. Now, when we get past the Bible itself and just talk to Christians, a Pew study from the Pew Research Center recently asked individuals to whether or not they had favorable attitudes towards unmarried couples having casual sex. About 67% of mainline Protestants, 2 out of 3, about 50% of all Christians, said that sex between unmarried consenting adults is acceptable. 79% of individuals who we call the nuns are unaffiliated said so as well. So it appears as if a lot of individuals believe that at least sometimes casual sex, which may be sex without love, would be okay. That leads to the second question that I have for us in our breakout room. So if we could go back there again and just spend about 5 minutes talking about how essential is love to good Christian sex. And what exactly do you mean by love? And what do you mean by good Christian sex? In more concrete terms, can hookups or casual sexual relationships lie within the boundaries of good Christian sex? So let's spend 5 minutes. How essential is love? Plenty of time. All right. So let me just open things up for a general conversation or for any comments or questions that individuals have.
So I'm looking around. I'll look around. If you can raise your hand on Zoom in the chat, that would be good. If you can't, then raise your hand on Zoom with your video on, and I will keep an eye out for people who have something to say, ask, or share.
I noticed the one comment in the chat that talks about the contractual nature of relationships that the Bible emphasizes, that these are not necessarily love and romance and dancing through the fields of flowers, but strictly contractual. And that gets back to that other form of association, more pragmatic.
And I'm continuing to look through. I will say there's a phrase that I'm going to carry with me and probably use in various contexts. And the phrase limited liability hedonism, I think speaks very, very well to a cultural moment that we live in. So I'm going to hold on to that one, put that in my back pocket.
Beth, I don't know what you're asking.
Yes.
97% of nuns. So nuns are not nuns like N-U-N, but N-O-N-E. That is, your religious affiliation is none. And 97% of those, I don't think it was quite that high. 79% of individuals who are not affiliated with any religious group think casual sex is okay. I'm sort of curious on individuals' definition of good Christian sex. I mean, if we look at the Bible, you might think it's sex that is intended for procreation, because that's kind of what God said at the beginning of Genesis, theoretically.
Yeah. Yeah, and I keep coming back to Ellen Barnard in our first session, saying her definition of healthy sexuality is that that it doesn't involve children, and that no one is getting hurt physically or emotionally. To me, those are some things that seem baseline in terms of respecting one another, and that's a Christian ethic in my heart. Marty, I saw your hand up first, and then Nan and Bob, Nan or Bob, you can proceed after. Marty, you are muted though, so you'll need to unmute first.
I unmuted. This unfortunately goes back to the previous conversation. So if you want to go on to Bob and Nan, you can. But I just was curious with the non-affiliated, why 21% of them would say that casual sex is wrong. What is their reasoning? Since it's not.
Great question. Unfortunately, the folks at the Pew Research Center did not ask that question. They just asked forced choice questions. So we really don't know exactly why that 21% are opposed.
Yeah, and I've got my own guesses, but can't imagine they'll be right. Nan or Bob, yeah, go ahead.
My comment was you pretty much said the same thing, Jeff. And I think that in a relationship or between even casual, if it's mutual, if it's respectful, if it's consenting, then I don't think it's immoral. That's my personal view. I think when it gets over into the date rape, into the use of drugs to overpower somebody or in a power struggle, then it becomes immoral. And that's about all I'll say. Thank you.
So Nan, do I have your permission to quote you anonymously to the youth group when we talk about when they should have sex?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
That could be at age 15 or 16.
Yes.
And Brad, you're the scientist here, but my sense of understanding is, well, the prefrontal cortex doesn't stop developing until 25, right? So I guess I'm not going to say that anything under 25 is inadequate for consent, but I do think that there's a certain level of maturity or growth that needs to happen before I think consent can be really given. You know, a 15-year-old doesn't have it just doesn't have it in my sense. Or at the very least, enough 15-year-olds don't that I'm not gonna, that I'd be comfortable making more of a rule there.
In our small group, we struggled with what exactly is love, a loving relationship, and how long does it take for us to get a handle on that? But what you said about the brain development is accurate. I noticed a couple other hands are up.
Yeah, Jenny and then Chris, or Jenny and Nick. I don't know which one of you.
It's Nick.
It was actually me. Yeah.
My bad.
So as you know, I think, you know, our group, and I think a lot of us agree that the foundation of a relationship is love. And so it makes it very easy to understand a sexual relationship with the foundation of love and having a loving type of, you know, interaction together. But at the same time, when we get out of the relationship, especially as it relates to marriage, like I would love to have like a crisp definition of what is adultery. Because to me, if we say, well, let's go to a commandment and we have a commandment not to commit adultery, well, then let's try to follow that, acknowledging that it's much easier for me to say that in a committed, loving relationship, as opposed to before I'm married or, you know, before when we're thinking about getting married or something like that. So to me, I would say, I still think it's like, I should tell my kids, I want you to be in a committed, loving relationship. I would like you to wait as long as possible, and ideally to marriage. I mean, we haven't had the conversation with the specifics of my kids, but where can we shoot for, acknowledging that in reality, things are more challenging in real life? So I'll be the comment, but is there such a thing as a exact definition of adultery that we could at least use to pin up and say it's in marriage? Or so if you are not in marriage, you commit adultery? I mean, how does that work?
It's a great question. I don't know how much, we have 4 minutes left. And so I don't know if there's an answer to that, Nick. And I don't know if there's one that can be done in 4 minutes and give other people some time for questions. But I appreciate your reflections, and hey, join us at noon for the sermon talkback. Chris, and then either Nancy or Peter. And then I think probably at that point, it'll be time to close in prayer.
Just a super quick comment that to add on to Nan and maybe to Nick, the whole idea of mutual consent and mutual respect and the granular nature of what that means, which is that, you know, if your partner is in the least bit debilitated, ambivalent, you know, slightly drunk, therefore, you know, well, maybe it's okay. That's not mutual consent and mutual respect. And I think that conversation is happening now, whereas in the past it wasn't. But a fuller definition of that is a good thing.
Yeah, and I think we keep continuing our ethic of consent, even beyond being altered by substances, but coercive power. And the dynamics in any relationship has power, and so navigating those dynamics within and consent can be very, very tangled. And I think it's a good thing that we keep this conversation going. Peter or Nancy.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the framework of mutual consent and respect. I'm not a scientist and don't know about the magical age of 25 when one's brain is fully developed for judgment. But I wanted to share that I think we learn at a very early age whether we are fair and hurting other people, and we can perceive and observe the feelings of others. And so my thoughts are when one engages with children of, teenagers, there has to be a capacity of empathy to understand whether one is hurting the feelings of others in the context of a sexual relationship. So those are my thoughts. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Peter. So we have 1 minute left. Heather, I'm gonna say I'll allow it. And then if I'm out of breath at the beginning of worship at 11 o'clock, you'll know why. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, super quick. I was just going to say our book club had an interesting discussion about this in the last couple of months. And one of the moms told her kids, however long you think you should wait, double that and wait that long. And I just thought that's an interesting thing because it just gives you more time to think, right? To make that decision.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brad. Thank you for your everybody here for your willingness to contribute and participate and be open and vulnerable. And Brad, thank you for facilitating this conversation. Always glad that we can make use of your wisdom and expertise. So now I'm going to close in prayer and sprint to the sanctuary. Let us pray. Holy and gracious God, help us to recognize the ways in which we hold each other, the effects of our words, our actions, of our bodies and selves on one another. Give us wisdom to discern what is or is not within our comfort, within our boundaries. Give us wisdom to discern how we may navigate that together. We pray for all those who are navigating this for the first time and for the 1000th time, that every time we make a decision, we ask that it be intentional and done with clear and decided purpose. Amen. All right. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Brad. And I will see you all soon. If you want to keep this going, the sermon talk back at noon. And otherwise, I'll see you soon.